what is work that matters? Work that matters is delivering value to customers, finding more customers, right? Some kind of combination of that. But we just spend so much time like dealing on KPIs, dealing on process, dealing with internal communication, all these things that are somewhat important on the margin. Yet, if that becomes all you're doing, can just feel so soul crushing and not why you're building a company.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. My name is Barrett Brooks. I'm your host. And this is a podcast made up of long-form interviews with people who are world-class at what they do, make a great living doing it, and who want to make a positive impact on the world around them through their work and lives. My guest today is Ankur Nagpal. Ankur was the founder of a company called Teachable that was a peer company to ConvertKit when I was there as COO in the creator economy. He's now the founder and CEO of a company called Carry that works to make both investment approaches and tax strategies available to everyday founders and business owners that would normally only be available to very wealthy people. And he's also the founder of Vibe Capital, which is a VC fund he started after selling Teachable. Teachable went on an incredible run where it grew 5x, 4x, 3x year over year. And eventually he sold it for a reported $250 million, $40 million of which was deposited into his bank account. And this episode is the story of how he got there, from immigrating from Oman to the US for college, how he started his first company in college and ended up paying for his own education at Berkeley for the second half of his college career, and how that eventually led him to New York and starting Teachable and selling it for an incredible amount of money, a life-changing amount of money. But this most special part of Ankur's story, I think, is that getting that money actually made him more of who he is. It helped him return to the things he values: family, relationships that matter to him, getting outside, getting exercise, and ultimately coming back to doing work with purpose, which is why he decided to get back into the startup game with Carry, even though he promised himself that was not what he was going to do after selling Teachable. This is a story of a man who has created great cultures, built companies that matter, and really been of service to both his teams and to his customers over time. I think everyone's going to find something to be inspired by, to look up to in Ankur's story, but also something that you can apply to your own life and your own leadership. So this is my conversation with Ankur Nagpal, founder of Carry, Teachable, and Vibe Capital. Let's get to it. Ankur Nagpal, welcome to the show.
Thanks, man. Excited to be here.
Yeah, great to have you here. So the place I want to start is, what makes cricket a beautiful sport?
I've spent my entire life watching cricket, and I'm convinced that, it was a big part of our culture. But what I find most enjoyable about the sport is it's a battle that takes place, well, in the longest format over a period of time. But it's sort of sport where it is both individual and a team sport at the same time. So as an example, when you're the batting side, you go out and you're facing the bowler, the pitcher, or whatever, but you're surrounded by the entire other team. So it's like one versus many. I've never seen a sport that, is a team sport, but can feel so alienating, so individual, but so much fun.
Yeah, I love that. I love seeing you talk about cricket because it's clear that you love it. It's not the most common discourse in the US. And I love seeing these little highlights that you'll share of like a big game going on in New York or whatever it might be. But you said that buying a cricket team might be one of the only things that could motivate you to continue to build wealth for wealth's sake. So I'm curious what team you would buy and what makes that fun and attractive to you.
The older I've gotten, the more drawn I am to the sorts of things that I found cool as a child. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yes.
But I go back to what would the 8-year-old version of me want to do. Honestly, I care less about which team. It would be like, I don't have strong loyalties to the team. I have stronger loyalties to the sport. But I guarantee you, I would be a very annoying manager. I would want to draft players. I would want to have a say in the actual team decisions and not just the business. So it would be annoying. But with that said, the Indian League, it is sort of the NFL of the sport. So that would be the equivalent of buying the team at the highest level. But with that said, I think cricket has quite a promising future in America, especially because there's 5 million South Asians here, biggest sport in the community does quite well. So I think the business of cricket is better here, but India is the gold standard when it comes to size of league.
It's like your Gary V equivalent, I'm going to go buy the Jets, except for I'm going to go buy a cricket team. I love that. You're going to be like the owner of the cricket league in the US eventually.
I'm going to be the most annoying one, but yes, I will.
I can relate though to the older I get and the more kind of freedom I have of time and money, the more I resort back to just the things I loved as a kid. Being outside, being in nature. I know that we share that. I've started collecting Pokemon cards with my kids. Like that's been a really fun activity that I've gotten unreasonably involved with. There's all these things that just become these little joyous, like you could call them frivolous almost in some cases, but they're a return to just like joyful little things that really sometimes don't cost much money or any money at all, but they become these really wonderful ways of connecting with my family and with myself. And it's funny how I think I've heard you say that you agree with the idea that money kind of makes you more of who you already were. And in some ways, I think it's a version of that. You kind of return
Absolutely.
to who you've always been.
I think also they go through a period, probably starts, I don't know, in our teenage years, definitely through your 20s, where you do certain things because you feel like you should, or you feel like people will like you more or validate you. Then you kind of stop caring, right? Then you reverse back to what you want to do because you want to do it. So I think you kind of fully go back there where it's less about external validation. If I find something cool and fun or whatever, I'm going to do it at this point.
Yeah, for sure. There's kind of that just ability to say, I don't care what, everyone else thinks I should be doing. I'm just going to go do it because I love it. So this is pretty common in your story that people will say in writing an article about you or interviewing you that you did not grow up in the US, although you've been here a long time now, came here for college. So as I understand it, you were born in Bombay and you lived in Oman for a lot of your life. I'm just curious what your experience growing up and in childhood was like in those places.
The big caveat before anything is I have nothing to compare it to, right? So it's not like I have a strong comparison. But looking back, I think life in Oman was life in a bubble. The upside of that is it was a pretty sheltered life, very high quality of life, beautiful country, very friendly people. But it was a bubble in that we were in an Indian community there, kind of cut off from the local population. It didn't feel like real life in a lot of ways. We were fairly sheltered growing up. Beautiful country. Identity was a little bit challenging since when people ask me, where are you from? Based on how long I have, I give a different answer, right? Because we grew up as Indian kids in Oman, moved to America. At this point, I feel okay saying I'm American, but growing up, we were never fully Indian. We definitely weren't fully Omani. So it was this weird sort of hybrid, but, had nothing but good memories going back.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. What took your family to Oman from India?
So in the early 80s, Oman had realized they had a lot of oil money. There was a new king. They had a lot of sort of natural resources, did not have a strong educated population. They had to try and start a country up from nothing. So my parents graduated college in India, and they probably earned like 20% more by moving, taking a 2-hour flight. So at that point, that was pretty attractive. So they moved there in the early 80s, along with a lot of who then became their friends. But big immigration boom. About 30% of Oman is from South Asia, even today.
Oh, wow. What were your parents' professions at the time?
My dad did an MBA, so he's just been in the management track, just doing random stuff like running local businesses, general manager, all of that. My mom worked for British Airways for about 20 years, which was incredible because it allowed us to travel for free. So as a result, we saw a lot of the world while also being very okay with going to the airport and getting kicked out of planes since all our travel was subject to availability.
Yeah. All standby travel, I guess. That's interesting. So I didn't know that part, that the roots of travel, which we'll get to in a bit. We're also going to come back around to your dad and how humorous y'all's relationship is. But I didn't realize that the travel had such strong roots and kind of like your upbringing. So what were some of those iconic trips that you took as a kid that shaped you?
So my parents really wanted us to travel even before they could afford it. I still remember, I don't know, I probably had to be 8 or 9 years old. And my dad took us to Europe in place of buying him a new car, right? Like that is approximately what they both cost. And early on, I wish I could say I love travel. At first, it was like, oh, it's a thing we did with our parents. But yeah, we went to Europe. I studied abroad in Australia for a couple of months. My parents visited me thereafter. Went to Turkey, went to Kenya, went to India almost every year. Seen a lot of the world relative to what a 13 or 14-year-old had at the time. And my mom's job was a big part of it, but it's also something my parents wanted to instill in me. They were quite frustrated though that I don't think I really kind of loved travel until, my mid 20s. So they thought their efforts were all in vain, but I think the roots definitely came from there.
Yeah. It's funny how those things take time to pay off. I try and keep that in mind with my kids, but my parents, they mostly took us all over the US. I don't think we ever traveled internationally as a family, but all over the country, national parks. We did a lot of hiking and camping and a lot of this stuff. And I remember whining a lot, just kind of like, why
Same.
are we doing this? I just want to be with my friends. Like, what is going on? And now all I want to do all summer long is like go sleep in a tent and go hiking and fishing and all this stuff. And it's just funny how it comes back around. But yeah, I think it comes back to that point you were making earlier. It's like we have to go through this period of identity separation and then reformation almost as we become adults, where we have to come back to, okay, what of these things do I want to claim as my own versus just what was instilled in me before?
Absolutely.
So you came to the US for college, right?
Yep. I came to the US, I came to America when I was 17 years old. I'd been to the US one time before, which was a year before, where we went to New York for 3 days, stayed around Times Square, and went to Orlando and went to Disney. And that was all I had seen of America until my first day of college.
And as I understand it, your parents kind of always had this plan that they wanted you to have the opportunity to come to the US for college. And I wonder what it was like from your seat coming here, having, kind of sight unseen, certainly for California where you ended up, and coming here alone versus what they saw as the opportunity, and like just that juxtaposition between those two things, the thing they wanted for you and the thing you experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. So pretty much no one in my high school stayed in Oman. So everyone ended up studying elsewhere. Some people went to India, some people went to the UK, some went to Australia. I think my dad read quite a bit growing up, and he was a big believer in American exceptionalism and that the US was the place to be. So even by 10th, 11th grade, he was like, okay, start studying for your SATs. Like your US college application is sort of the most important thing for you to do. He always believed I would do better in the American system just because like the Indian system was based on like memorization, a lot of like hard work, which I don't think I was particularly good at, especially at school. So he felt like the US system would be good for me. And as a result, I knew pretty young that's where I would be going. Coming to the US was very exciting, but also because at that point, being 16, 17 years old, Oman felt like a really small country. And I remember some part of me was just excited to like get out, live elsewhere, be by myself and figure that stuff out. So while there was a little bit of a culture shock or whatever, I was mostly just very excited to go out and kind of find my own life.
So I went to school like an hour and a half from my parents, and that was far enough that they couldn't just completely show up unannounced, although I guess they could have if they wanted to, looking back. What was it like to be basically around the world from your family after that being kind of like the core? It's clear in everything you talk about that family is so core to who you are. And so now here you are around the world from all the people that you've relied on your whole life. Was it odd, or did you just kind of like seize the day and go make things happen for yourself?
It's a bit of both, right? You start out super excited. You're like, I'm free. I can go out. I don't have to like report to anyone. I can stay out late. Couple of months pass and you start to like, miss home a little. I still went back pretty much every like winter break. I saw my parents at least twice a year. But I remember the first winter back, I was also very, very excited to go back. Eventually, look, I think the older I got, the more sort of guilt I've had about leaving family. When you're younger, at least in my case, 18, 19, 20, it seemed like fun and the right thing to do and, to go out and live my life. It's, again, as time has passed that I wouldn't change anything about where I live or what I've done, but I definitely do feel this sort of guilt where my parents worked really, really hard to build this life for me. And in return, they mostly have to grow older by themselves. And that kind of sucks. But that's a fairly common feeling for kind of anyone that's had, the journey or the background that I've had or we've had.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating, just kind of juxtaposition. It's like they worked their whole lives in some ways so that you could have this opportunity. My wife, similarly, I don't know if you listen to this show, I've shared this a little bit, but she was born in Singapore and they came to the US. Her parents now live with us. So we have that's a difference there. But it was a similar kind of feeling of like really all of the sacrifice that leads to the opportunity for the kids of, in this case, your parents didn't immigrate with you, but it's a similar kind of story that is actually surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly to you, given your investing background now and all of that, but many of the people I've invited on this show, not because of this, but just by happenstance, have this same story or their version of this story, that they are the first generation to kind of immigrate here and have the opportunity here. And that just is part of the like ethos that has helped them succeed at the level that they have. It's been a fascinating theme that I didn't anticipate.
That's also what I find to be like my favorite thing about America, and why I think America has been so good at everything, is because it creates this like talent magnet where you get smart, motivated people from around the world to come here, and as a result, the country benefits. The strength of immigration here is, in my opinion at least, why we have so many successful businesses, why we're doing really well in innovation. I mean, you look at the data, like the number of people running everything who weren't even born in the country.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. There's so I'm a college football fan just because of where I went to school, and the SEC is this conference in the Southeast here, and they're kind of like the talent magnate for all of the talent in the country, and everyone else is kind of trying to compete with them. So all my Big Ten fans and Pac-12 or whatever will get mad at me.
Pac-12 is done, sadly.
Yeah. Pac-12 showed that it was true. And it's a very similar thing that like the US kind of has going for it. It's almost an unfair advantage. It's like you skim the top talent from the entire world and say, come here and build things and work on things. And you talk a lot about this on Twitter of the visa situation and helping people come here, because I think of this belief that you have that we should actively try and make it possible for more and more talented people to come here. So what's made you want to be a supporter of people in that role, or sign off on visas for people as references, things like that?
I think it's a very natural bias you have when you've been through something that's annoying or painful. You empathize with it more. So I've been through every sort of US visa situation. I couldn't start Teachable until I got a green card. But in the process, I had to be on a student visa. I had sponsored a training program for my own LLC. There's all these loopholes, by the way, which is the stuff I love. Apparently, you can sponsor a training program from your own LLC. So I created a company, sponsored my own training, extended that training. Visa was about to run out. I was about to get kicked out. I found the cheapest community college near me, signed up for the cheapest degree I could find. I think it was like $2,000 a semester. And I signed up for songwriting classes, just taking random stuff just to stay on in the country. Finally, I got an O1 visa at a friend's business. But all of these little loopholes or whatever, to look back on, pretty fun. You're like gaming the system. At the time, very high stakes. You get this wrong, you're out of the country. The entire life you've worked so hard to build, that your family's worked so hard to build, is done. And I've seen this repeated across pretty much everyone I know. Like, it's funny. I go back home to Oman. There's a dinner party. I meet my parents' friends. Everyone's asking which visa are you on. Like that is like the most popular discussion topic amongst like my mom and her friends.
That's fascinating. And now, of course, with hindsight, it felt high stakes at the time to you. And had you known how high stakes it was in terms of outcomes, that would have been even more intense because of all the good things that have happened since then, which we'll get to. But
and think about it, right? There's like a lot of people who had exactly my background who did not figure out their visa. We're never going to know what could or may have happened in that sort of scenario, right?
Yeah. So I'm not totally familiar with all the different types of visas. So you talk a lot about O1 visas. What is an O1 visa and what makes it different?
So an O1 visa is something that I discovered like 10 or 11 years ago. Someone told me about it. It's technically called an alien of extraordinary ability. So clearly America is very welcoming. You're still called an alien as part of that. But if
I'm laughing out of shame for what it's worth, just for the people listening, not watching. Yeah.
If you have a relatively competent lawyer, it's not that hard to make a claim that you have extraordinary ability. The word scares a lot of people, right? I mean, you worked at ConvertKit, I worked at Teachable. Like, we've seen how people disqualified themselves so many times, which is why I talk a lot about it, because my guidance to people is don't disqualify yourself from that. If you can find a good lawyer, you can define your ability very, very specifically. I think my application was defined that I'm very good at building Facebook applications for a specific reason. But if you scope it narrowly enough, it's not that hard to make a convincing case. And right now, approval rates for that visa are super high. They're like 95% or something. So for a lot of people, I think that's the best pathway. Otherwise, you have to do what's called an H-1 visa, which is tied to your employer. there's a lottery. The lottery can go either way, and it gets much harder.
Yeah, and that's the one I think that gets talked about a lot more often. A mutual friend of ours and mentor has this story that he tells where he talks about being world class and that anyone can be world class as long as you define the world the right way.
Exactly.
If your world is your neighborhood, if your world is your city, if your world is a thin slice of an industry or whatever, Facebook apps, like where you kind of got your start in business, it gets a lot easier to become world class.
Correct. But as a result, part of this application, you have to find at least 10 supporting letters. So one of the things I've been doing for people is at this point, I've probably signed hundreds of letters for people, even people I may not know personally or know super well. How much does it matter? It's just one very small part of an application, but it's profoundly meaningful to the person whom you sign it for.
Right.
And it takes such little time. The number of emails and notes and people send me physical gifts after they've like gotten it just with gratitude. And all I've done is like hit a DocuSign, right? Like it's the easiest thing in the world. And it's made such a big impact to people in a very similar boat.
Yeah, it's a fascinating requirement. It's very reminiscent of how in some municipalities or states you have to get a number of signatures to get on a ballot to be elected, for example. And there's kind of like this: do you know enough people who are willing to sign their name so that we believe that you belong here? It's a very fascinating thing, but it's an incredible act of generosity to put it out there the way you have. You've got a pretty sizable audience now. So, and I think you probably tend to attract people who are trying to learn from you from similar backgrounds. And so it's just a beautiful act of generosity that I admire you a ton for. So when you were at Berkeley, you've talked about this guilt that you felt and this sense of owing your parents for all that they did to help you get here. And there was this internal battle going on between you where if you had been funding your own education and it had all been just because of you, maybe you wouldn't have gone to class as much. Maybe you wouldn't have kind of like been as engaged as you were, because it wasn't inherently interesting to you. And you told us an amusing story at one point that had you had a fake ID, you might never have done all the things that you did. But since you didn't, you hung out in your dorm room and you built Facebook apps. And so I wonder if you might just tell a little bit of the story about how you kind of created this balance between what you felt you owed your parents and the direction you wanted to move in by building Facebook apps at the time.
Yep, absolutely. So at the time, Berkeley, I believe, cost $30,000 all in as an international student, which for the conception of money I had at the time was infinite money, right? It was infinite. There was no, so it just felt like the single most expensive thing. And it was the single most expensive thing my family had bought to that point, that saved up for it. There was a lot of like, okay, I better not mess this up. They're betting a lot on this. So first year, I started college pretty young. I was 17 when I got there, only turned 18 at the end of my freshman year. But at the end of my freshman year, I got an internship at Amazon. So I was in Seattle at the time, 18 years old. In retrospect, I think it was too young to be at an adult job, because I remember going to the office and being like, is this what life is going to be like? This kind of sucks. This is not that fun. My team was substantially older than me. They were quite disengaged. I don't think they really cared whether I did anything or not. Like corporate assigns you an intern, right? They don't really, I didn't have enough skill to be super useful. I was going anyway, so why train me? And I remember just being a little disillusioned with this whole process. Like our entire team, for instance, was working on one page within Seller Central. So within one dashboard, there's one page and that's our entire team. So it's like a bad indication of what corporate America is like. But this coincided with when we'd all gotten on Facebook a year ago. It was very popular in college at the time. This coincided with the launch of the Facebook platform. And it was that summer, I was living in Seattle, probably the unhappiest I'd been on a personal level, because coming to college was fine. It wasn't alienating because everyone was in the same position. Interning in Seattle, knowing no one, not having a fake ID, couldn't go out to the few things people were doing, was probably the most isolated I'd felt up to that point in my life, right? So I started spending my evenings messing around, building Facebook applications, and that became my sort of passion for the summer. And by the end of that summer, I was able to get to a point of making maybe like $20 a day or something. But that was a very, very, very pivotal moment in my life, because, and I say this also, by the way, to anyone who ever makes money online. The first time you do it, something in your brain changes. You realize that you can, instead of putting up with corporate whatever, you can do things on the internet and make money. And that switch flipped by the end of that summer. And through the following semester was probably the balancing act of like, what do I do for school? What do I not do for school? But by the end of the following semester, I'd made enough money that I could pay for my fourth semester. So second semester, my sophomore year, myself. And then all bets were off. Then I'm not going to class. Then I'm living the life I want. The guilt is gone. And, I felt this burden lifted off. I still graduated, but I, was no longer operating from a place of fear or guilt versus like, I can now do what I want.
So did you take over the college bills from your parents and say, hey, I got this now?
I did. It was a battle. Like at first they didn't want to give it to me, but as soon as I hit six figures, they were like, okay, fine. I see your point. And I, again, made the same argument to my dad being like, put yourself in my shoes. I selfishly want to do this, right? It will allow me to enjoy my college experience more if I do this.
Yeah. So I can imagine them kind of like clinging to this gift and dream they've had for you and wanting to give it to you. And you saying like, no, I'm ready to claim my independence. Like, I'm good. I'm going to get the gift, even if you let me take this over.
Correct.
And it will give me all of this other freedom that I want.
I still remember being home for Christmas break after that third semester, took my parents out to dinner. I paid for dinner. That was enough to make my mom cry with a combination of pride and guilt. So it took a while to get them okay.
That's incredible. So this escalated quickly, right? You started with kind of making $20 a day and we saw this over and over. It was one of our, we were constantly searching for like, what is our equivalent of that magic moment that Facebook talked about with like 7 friends and all of that. And we ended up talking about a few of them at ConvertKit, but one of them was when someone made their first dollar. Just that first dollar where someone realizes like, oh, I set up a Stripe account. I made this random little ebook or course or whatever it was, and someone bought that thing. Okay, everything has just changed in my life. It just, this like freedom and agency switch goes off in someone's mind. But you escalated quickly. Like I think you've said by the time you were 21 or something, you had made $1 million off of building these Facebook apps. I think you know this, but that is remarkable. And I wonder what allowed it to escalate so quickly. Was it just the timing of where Facebook was at the time and you being there, or what was it?
It was a remarkable time and place. Like, I still haven't seen anything like it in my professional career. Facebook was growing really, really fast. I mean, through this whole journey, Facebook was growing as well. So you had the tailwind of their audience was growing. They opened up their platform like no one had before. You could send friend requests, you could send notifications, you could send feed posts. So you're giving all these really powerful tools. And as a result, it wasn't just our application. So many applications, you could go from 0 to 1 million users in like a day. And it's just never seen anything like it. So obviously, I think like, yes, we were good at what we did. We figured out a lot of stuff. It was also a delicate balancing act because you had to be aggressive without crossing the line. Yet, based on who you were, the penalties for crossing the line were not that bad. So as an example, if you were Mark Pincus, you ran a company called Zynga, they were a public company. They did some pretty egregious things, but when they got into trouble, Mark Pincus got a call. When we got into trouble, we got a cease and desist. So it was like, you have to be aggressive, you have to be smart, but you have to know sort of where to draw the line. And it was a fun sort of cat and mouse game for several years. We built, little social games, personality quizzes, friend quizzes, got very, very good at sort of the art of viral growth. But every few months, it would all come crashing down. So there's always these cycles where it would go really well, then go back to nothing, go really well, go back to nothing. And lasted a good 3 years, but a lot of ups and downs.
So what's an example of one of the things that was aggressive, but on the line at the time that was kind of like one of these types of loopholes that they might have shut down and then you'd have to retool around?
So our most successful app was a concept of asking questions about people. So and again, our target audience is high school kids and college kids and whatever. You get a notification, this girl you may know from school answered a question, do you think Barrett is cute? But in order for you to see the answer, you can either answer 25 questions about your friends, thereby generating more of this, or you could take an action that pays us $1 or try a Netflix subscription or something. So that mechanic worked really well. There were also like all these things that worked. There was another thing we built that I think was the fastest thing we grew. It was called Best Friend Predictor. So we're like, hey, you know what? Come in, press a button, and we're going to predict who your best friends are. And there's a little animation and all of that. And the results were pretty accurate, but all we did is we actually requested your photo permissions and we saw who you were in the most photos with. So most people had no idea that's how we figured it out, but it worked remarkably well. So you're always like kind of doing this little social engineering stuff. It was fascinating. I learned so much about humans and people and, but yeah, you're always playing these little games.
Yeah. I'm curious what you learn in that whole process, especially about growth and those kind of social dynamics and what people respond to, how that carried through even to now with Carrie. Like, what did you learn there that has continued to be valuable to you over time in your companies?
The whole growth hacking movement came out several years before. So this is prior to that. But we learned experimentation and data and all of that stuff pretty fast. As an example, by the end, in the friend quiz, any question you got at any given point, we were writing tens, if not hundreds of questions per day. They were all getting tested to like measure the viral coefficient of every one of them and then being categorized to doing it. We also built this other thing where we created an app that could create applications. So as a result, let's say we created a template app where you could throw X item to your friend. Now you could create an app saying throwing any item, but as a result, you would always catch every single like pop culture trend right before it happened. So you learn if you like the advantage of like user generated content is you don't have to think about catching pop culture. Like 95% of your content will be terrible, but there won't be a single trend you miss out on. So there's all these little lessons we learned pretty early on, while also technically learning a lot of stuff. Like the scale we hit, we came up against like our database software. We're using MySQL, couldn't handle the scale we were doing. I had a systems administrator, downtime. There were all these like very dramatic things. Things I was not good at is the way we set up the business was like literally what you'd expect from a college kid. Like I talked to someone, I'm like, hey, you want to manage our servers? Cool. How's 10%? Okay, you want 20%? Done. It was that kind of relationship.
I've heard an example of this that you actually didn't know you had to pay taxes at the time, which given what you do now is funny and ironic. Yeah. But talk to me about how you handled that when you found out you had to pay taxes. You had made $1 million by this point or in that neighborhood, and you find out, oh my God, I've spent 3 years and I've been supposed to be paying this. This could actually threaten a lot of things here for me. So how did that turn out?
There's also multiple things it could have threatened, not just like tax fraud. There is also the whole immigration fraud because as a student, you're not allowed to make money on a visa. So very stressful time through all of this. But I remember going to finding smart lawyers and attorneys or whatever in San Francisco. And I think to their credit, they were pretty nice, but they were just like, the whole thing was just like, they're like, wait, what is happening? How is there a 20-year-old who's made millions of dollars? Like, what are we doing? Why aren't we doing that? But also just like not paid any taxes. And eventually we obviously paid all the taxes. We took the stance that, look, this is a genuine mistake. We didn't like intend to do this. And to their credit, the IRS actually dropped almost all of the penalties. So there were no penalties. But growing up in Oman, there was no taxes. I mean, if your salary was, 1,000 riyals, that's what you received in the bank account. So taxes were a very new concept to me at the time.
Yeah. Which we'll also get to here in a little while, because it's now, I think you're one of the best kind of advocates and people teaching how to use the tax code to your advantage, given what the tax code makes available to you. I think it's easy to kind of demonize this idea of like avoiding taxes, but there's a difference between that and taking advantage of the things the government intends for you to take advantage of. And so we'll get there, but you came out the other end of this and you ended up moving from California to New York, and you've been there a long time now. I'm curious, what has made New York, and maybe more specifically Brooklyn, feel like and become home for you?
Absolutely. My catalyst for moving to New York was honestly being 23. I was 23 years old and I visited New York for a weekend. I had a bunch of friends here and it felt like the single most exciting place to be. Lasted in Manhattan for about 5 or 6 years. Eventually ended up moving to Brooklyn, and it's become home in a way that people in the rest of the country will not find any of this special, but it's truly a community that's kind of hard to find in New York City specifically. Like I think no matter where I go, I see people I know, relatively speaking. Like I remember the first time I moved to Brooklyn, The advantage was like I had a balcony. I had like a small sliver of outdoor space I could claim as my own, right? And I was close by to a park with tennis courts, which in most of the country is the easiest thing in the world. But New York to me, again, like what America is to the world, New York sometimes is to America, where it's become this magnet where people from all over, even if they don't live here, stop over here. Even friends who don't live in the city, I end up seeing once, if not 2 or 3 times a year as they're passing through. So it's truly incredible for that. Pedestrian culture is also very important to me. I spend so much of my time walking around, taking calls, and I think there's probably 2 or 3 cities in the US total where they have like a real pedestrian culture. So that part is great. I was saying, with that said, candidly, I'm 35 now. I do feel New York has its time and place, and my business is here, and I love being in person. But if not for that, I would probably audit. It's been a great 12 years here. I would audit whether it's still the city that made the most sense.
Okay, so let's say you were in an alternate universe and you had decided you really didn't want to start another company and you could be anywhere. What would be the factors you'd be considering at this point in your life for where to be?
At this point, proximity to family would definitely be a factor. It doesn't definitely mean I would be very close to them, but it would absolutely be a factor as my family is getting older. Like walkability, pedestrian culture, super important. Diversity of people, and by diversity of people, it's not sort of diversity in the American way, but diversity in like, I think it's cool to know people from all around the world. Like I grew up in a country that had international people and people from different parts of the world. So that part is cool. Diversity also of like, am I around people that motivate me to be better, right? Like, am I around people that inspire me? Inspire me doesn't have to mean I'm around a bunch of business people. It can be people who inspire me in other ways as well. And the last dimension that I think I'm missing in New York is access to the outdoors. Like that is the part that just kills me about New York City is you're just so far from anything cool outdoors wise.
Well, number one of the reasons I love conversations like this is that point about being around smart people and just being motivated by other people doing great things. But one of the things I love about Portland is we lose out on a lot of what New York gives you. It's like a good balance of we have great food culture and cocktails and coffee and all that kind of stuff. But the one thing that we beat almost any city in the world on is outdoor access. And that's the thing I love about being here is I can do that anytime, an hour in any direction I'm in. Beautiful, like world-class beauty of nature. So
how dark does it get in the winter? Like
it is a dark time right now. We I think it's like pretty much pitch black by 5 this time of year. It's this time of year, the transition to when the clocks change and the sun goes down that early, I always go into this kind of state of melancholy because it's just very, very weird to basically get done working every day and have it be pitch black. I do not love that.
Yeah. We have beautiful sunsets at the office. It's just not ideal when they're at 4:30.
Yes, exactly. It's not my favorite thing. So I actually have 2 questions further about New York, because I think, Paul Graham has this great essay about cities and ambition or something like that, and how a city shapes you as a person. And so I'm curious how the city and being there for the time that you've been there has shaped you as a person and as a leader too, as a business person.
So again, what America is to the world, New York is to America. And as an example, I do think there's no better country in the world to build a business than the US. And at New York, you're sort of at the cutting edge of that, where everyone in the city is honestly just good at what they do, no matter what they choose. Like, silly thing, right? You look at sort of, you run a half marathon here, you run a marathon here. Everyone is going to be pretty good. Like, you take any specific activity, everyone's very competitive. Everyone wants to do well. Everyone wants to win. And I think that's a great sort of thing to have, especially when you're younger. I think it pushes you to be the best version of yourself. It's an aggressive place in a way that I think is good for you. So I think that has been very helpful and very formative. As an example, I spent the month of February living in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and it was such a paradox because everyone in Argentina honestly was probably happier. Their like day-to-day was very different, but like they were relaxed. They looked like they were having a better time than anyone in New York. But at the same time, when I was there, I was working less hard. Like everything around me was telling me, yeah, have that extra glass of wine at 11:30, and like life is to be lived. And I think both are beautiful things. You just have to kind of find the right chapter for each.
I don't know that we'll go down the rabbit hole here, but I remember when you were in Argentina, you tweeted this thing about how having a bunch of steak and red wine in Argentina, you felt healthier than like all of your health optimizations combined in the US, and how that's somewhat indicative of either culture or exposure to whatever we get exposed to in our food system and all of that here. That's probably for another day, but it was
I'll
just a
save that
fascinating
because
insight.
that could be like a 15-minute tangent. So I think
Yeah,
we'll
yeah.
just
Yeah, I think we're both pretty passionate about it. It's one of those things. But yeah, the difference in culture between places is fascinating, which is kind of my last question on this place element. So if we had this 2-hour conversation and someone listened and we never talked about where you live, I think most people would assume you were in the Bay Area in California. And so I'm curious what made New York the right place instead of the Bay Area for the path that you wanted to follow.
honestly, a lot of it came down to me going down this path when I was 23 years old and not married and all of that. New York was just a more exciting city for me to be as an individual, and everything else came as a downstream effect of that. I'd first tried living in San Francisco. I just found San Francisco to be too much of a monoculture where everyone was in tech, and I wanted to get out of that. At that age, I also didn't appreciate what California is great at. Like now I go back, I have an incredible time because now I like to hike. Now I like to surf. At 22, I was looking up, which horrible club to go to, and it was never anything good.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. It's funny how these things, in hindsight, they end up shaping so much of you, but at the time, they're just kind of, maybe not flippant, but they're not the kind of criteria that you would sit with today. To your point about where you might choose to live
And
now.
to be honest, it is a saving grace at some level that work is here and I'm not thinking about it, because I know a lot of people, and I'm fully capable of doing this myself, of constantly auditing, am I living in the best city at the best time? And especially people who don't have kids, don't have anything tying them to a place.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen a lot of friends kind of move cities every 6 months, and that's also not a good place to be.
Yeah, it's hard too. I mean, we have had great community here in Portland over time, and we've had to change that community drastically because of the number of people who have been in that position. With our backgrounds, especially working in the creator world as much as we did, Portland attracted that kind of person for a long time. We had a lot of really close friends who were really high level creators, excellent at what they did. But the thing about the creator world is you have complete location flexibility. A lot of these businesses can be run anywhere. And in some cases, I think some of them made the choice to let the tax tail wag the dog.
Did you lose people to Puerto Rico?
We have, not from Portland, but we have lost friends from the US. Well, from the US mainland to Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is a US territory. But we lost a lot of people to Austin because of state income tax.
How high are state income taxes in Oregon?
10% for a lot of the kind of earning potential that a lot of people here have. And there's no differentiation between that and capital gains.
You always hear about 10% in like New York and California. You don't hear about the 10% in Oregon as much, but yeah, that's quite a bit.
So Portland for high earners is now the second most expensive city in the country behind New York.
Wow.
Yeah. It's so anyways, side note, but very relevant to where we'll go. I'd be obviously totally remiss if we didn't cover the kind of Teachable chapter for a little while. Teachable was a company that was very much a peer and a partner to ConvertKit. I mean, we were kind of in the same game at the same time. And what's fascinating about when we got our starts in that space that's come to be known as the creator economy is it was not a thing when we got started. No one respected it. Venture capitalists didn't want to touch it. It was this like weird offbeat kind of thing that no one understood. And
including us.
And it's not even like, you didn't mean to turn it into what Teachable became. Nathan didn't mean to turn ConvertKit into what it became. They were both actually kind of side projects in a way, or like little outpourings of other things you were doing. So you were teaching on Udemy. You got annoyed at the fees they were charging and said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And that ended up with you building Teachable, which became kind of the leading course and teaching platform in the creator economy over time. But when it got started, it was a nothing burger, both that industry and the company. So I'm curious, as you look back now, kind of on the creator economy as a whole, what do you think made that transition happen from it kind of being this like off the beaten path thing to it being one of the hottest investable asset classes for a period of time? What created that transition?
Again, like the Facebook apps, like with most things in my life that have worked out, I think right place and right time happened in a way that I didn't control. The tailwind here that I think helped all the fuzz is the proliferation of all the social networks where you could build an audience. Because prior to that, you still kind of had the creator economy, but it was largely blogs. It was
Yep.
blogs and SEO, which was much, much smaller. But now all of a sudden you had YouTube, Instagram, whatever, even Pinterest, all of these channels that now meant millions of people could build a viable audience. So it expanded our market size in a way that I think none of us predicted, but obviously worked out quite well for us.
Yeah. It was a fascinating time to be a part of, and it's interesting to see what it's become because it's continued to change. So I want to ask you about where you think it's going, but first I want to come back to Teachable. And you talked about a few things related to this company, but one of them is that although you grew to the point where the CEO job wasn't as fun for you eventually, and I totally get that because we've had similar experiences there from different seats, you also loved that team. And it was really special to you. And I know that just based on seeing you operate, knowing the people who were there. I wonder if there's kind of a moment that represents like peak nostalgia for you about that company that captures that people orientation and what was really special about it.
I remember there was a time that was quite hard for me personally. I'd been dating this girl for, quite a while and almost 7 years. And I remember it was a tough breakup just because 7-year relationship,
Yeah.
really, really hard. But the day we broke up, I was surrounded by like a couple of friends, but like 4 people from the company, right? Like that's how close we were, that they were sort of the go-to people. I spent a few days living in the office, which I wouldn't recommend. But it was, like that's when I realized that like if I'm going through something hard, my support structure was sort of, the team that we had built. We'd spent so much time together that that's who I kind of turned to in my, time of need or whatever. So during that entire period, which is why I tend to think our sweet spot, hard to pinpoint the exact numbers, between 25, 30 people or so, somewhere around there, give or take 10, 20 on either side, but tens of people when it's a real company, but not at the point where there's all these layers and all of that. And the difference between, I guess, both of our companies is we were in person every single day. At the time, I started Teachable when I was 23, 24 years old. So this would have been, I was 27, 28. So it was all of us were clustered around the same age. So yes, we were building a company, but we're also all just, kids in our 20s living in New York City, going through our life together. So
Right.
special time, but obviously with that comes challenges and growth and all of that.
Yeah, of course. It's almost like you all grew up together. I mean, I certainly feel that. I certainly grew up as a professional, but really as a person during
As a
that
person.
chapter of my career. It can sound kind of weird to people, especially maybe who haven't been in startups. It's like, wait, you broke up with someone and your work friends were the people who were like supporting you. But there is something about that I think adds value to the company as well. There's like this layer of friendship and trust at that stage of company building. Yeah, around that 25, 30 person mark
It's,
where everyone knows everyone, your stories, you probably spend time together outside of work, especially if you're working in person. And that actually does fuel company progress in some way. And I'm curious if you saw that play out at Teachable.
Absolutely. Like two sides of the coin. Like I think their downsides, I think the upsides more than made up for it, but it's not without downsides. But yes, I mean, especially with some of the closer team like Andy and Sid who now run a company called Circle. I mean, we probably drank too much. We went out, after work 2 or 3 times a week. And, we just spent so much time together that, yeah, very often 1 or 2 drinks in, we're like fighting about what our go-to-market motion should be and having like, super animated, passionate conversations. And those were incredible times. At the same time now in my 30s, I don't even want that. I couldn't do it. It doesn't make
Yes.
sense for sort of this chapter of my life. At the time, like I wouldn't trade those days for anything. And it worked because of who we were at that specific time as well.
So what were some of those pain points that played out from that as well? Because I saw some of that too in our culture and we were remote. And so there was a big difference there. But what were some of the pain points?
I still struggle with this, but it became very hard for me to figure out what I should do like as a CEO and what I should do as a person. As an example, like consider loyalty, right? Like loyalty is a trait that is very important to me as a person. If you've shown loyalty towards me as a friend or whatever, that's meaningful. When you're running a company, loyalty is one of many dimensions, right? As a CEO, you're always thinking, is the right person in the right job? Like, so what if they've been loyal to us for 4 years, 5 years, or whatever? Should we hire someone above them? And that's a very simplistic example, but you're constantly having to think about people as resources, which is something that I just struggled with and was the source of so much internal dilemma, stress, all of that. Still don't have a great solution to a lot of it. I think some of it you get better at with time, but I think it was constantly quite challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear that. I mean, it's almost like in some cases, loyalty becomes more of a factor in how good the severance package is versus whether someone stays. And that can just eat you up inside when it's like,
Right.
I love this person and we've outgrown them.
Mhm.
And when they're your friend, that shit is brutal. It is brutal on, I would call it on the soul, is kind of how I think about
Absolutely,
it.
right? Like those are the only times it's like made me question, do I want to be doing this at all?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are also the times somehow that you like magically forget between things, and it's like, oh, I want to go back and I want to do it again. And so it's just funny how like you learn from them, of course, and you don't repeat the same mistakes in the same way. But there's selective memory involved in some of this stuff where
I
you
just
just
I
have
just
to kind
think
of put it away.
that's how nostalgia works. That's why nostalgia can be one of the most like powerful yet annoying drugs, because nostalgia just like overemphasizes the good memories in your mind, and then selectively makes you forget the harder ones.
Yeah. My wife and I talk about that in terms of the pregnancy and birthing process, that like and even to having very young children who don't sleep, it's like you forget about that. And that is biologically
A
beneficial
good thing.
because it makes you want to have more kids, right? Which is how we all end up here to begin with. So it's just funny how there's something similar in parallel with company building for people who do it more than once. Yeah, one of the questions I had here was kind of a moment that epitomized why it sucked to be the CEO of a 100-person company versus that like 25 or 30-person company. I wonder if there's another example aside from that kind of like people-oriented stuff.
On the professional side, I had insecurities that like I don't know what I'm doing, so let me go out and hire the professionals that do. I look back now and I realize that they didn't know much either, but kind of seeing them do what I now consider to be, I don't want to use the word dumb things, but just things that don't matter. We just started spending all this time doing work that doesn't matter. So, what is work that matters? Work that matters is delivering value to customers, finding more customers, right? Some kind of combination of that. But we just spend so much time like dealing on KPIs, dealing on process, dealing with internal communication, all these things that are somewhat important on the margin. Yet, if that becomes all you're doing, can just feel so soul crushing and not why you're building a company. A breaking point was I was already at a point where I wasn't like thrilled with how our app was looking. There's a lot of things that needed work, but our designer was making an executive's deck look nicer for an internal presentation. It's like, what are we doing?
What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Yeah. The work about work stuff is easy to, and some of it matters, and one of those things that you talk about a lot that I actually wanted to touch on is this idea of an investor update and how reflective it is of a level of operation that many people don't show to investors. And, not everyone that listens to this podcast is a founder with investors. And so that's not necessarily my point here. So I want to get to a point that I think is relevant to everyone. But my first question is, what went in your investor updates that you sent every month? Like, what were you reporting on?
So we sent investor update on the pretty much the first of every month for many, many years. It didn't matter if the first was a Saturday, a Sunday, New Year's Day, a holiday, whatever. The updates were never long, but they always had our actual metrics. So revenue, total amount of course sales, number of customers, month-on-month growth, and then a little snapshot of how the month went. And I always tell founders, this is such a good cheat code because if you do this, people will make the assumption you're on top of shit, you're organized, things are not chaotic. We were chaotic, we were disorganized, but I got that update out on the first of every month, and it just bought us so much credibility. Every time we raised money in the future, it was from someone already on the list. We used it to recruit candidates. We used it to like keep X team members informed. We used it for so many things that it just became such a powerful tool, even for internal communication.
I'm actually interested in this because I think the act of doing it is valuable beyond just the investors. There's something about the
Absolutely.
practice of it as a leader that keeps you in tune with the business and actually helps you tell the story of the business. And so I wonder, like, in what ways the discipline was helpful to you, because that's my take on it. But also, if you think it would actually be valuable to people who run companies, even if they have no fiduciary duty to do it to anyone.
Yeah. I would imagine the percentage of investors on our investor update at any given point was no more than 20%, like active investors. Call it an investor update, but at most it's 20% investors. It's employees, it's people I want to recruit in the future, it's investors that have passed on us, it's investors that we may want to raise from in the future. With Carry, it's actually public, so it's thousands of random people. And it was super helpful, even at the end of the month, to kind of audit how the month went. And what's important to do is what I like to see founders do, especially companies I've invested in, is being brutally honest. Like there are a lot of times where I could dress the month to seem amazing, but I find it to be more inspiring if a founder is like, well, the numbers are pretty good, but I'm actually unhappy with it. So very often I'll be like, you know what? July was a 6.5 out of 10, or August sucked, or whatever. And so it's very, very blunt in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's a practice that I'm actually starting to play with in my business where I'm going to create kind of my own group of friends and advisors. You know, it might be people who have been on the podcast or just friends who have been in my life a long time and start sending my version of this. I realize that it's just a practice that I will benefit from. And having anyone on the other end who is halfway smart will make me take it seriously. And so I'm just going to be interested to see what that practice is like and whether it helps me.
Big fan of it. I also think, especially as a founder, if you're trapped where you can't raise money and you're like stuck and you want to find a way to like get unstuck, it's a super helpful practice since it, one, helps you raise money. Two, it's a follow-up. Whenever an investor says no, ask them if they want to be in your update, and you start building a little bit of momentum.
Yeah, that's super smart. I want to ask one more question before we kind of transition away from Teachable, which is, you know, Teachable grew like 5x, 4x, 3x, 2x, and eventually you sold the company. And anyone who's heard of you before will know that by now, but just to kind of spoil it a little bit, you ended up selling the company. And I want to get into that whole process. But I want to ask you one more question about the creator economy first, because it's at an interesting point right now. AI is changing a lot of things, but the biggest thing I think it's changing is I think SEO and content design for SEO is basically going to become irrelevant now for creators. It was already on its way out. And I think it's going to become less and less relevant going forward, depending on what part of the kind of world you work in. Like food bloggers, I think there's always going to be a role for recipes, and there's some different things like that. My point in all of that, regardless of whether that becomes true, is everything is shifting right now. And what the creator economy will be in 10 years is going to be very different from what it looks like today, just like it's very different than it was 10 years ago. Curious what you think will change for creators, you know, let's call creators, writers, podcasters, YouTubers, artists over the next 10 years from where we are today.
The reality is, I believe a lot of us learned in the last few years, the creator economy is not that dissimilar. In fact, it could honestly just be a subset of the SMB economy or whatever. Like in our mind, we had this clear distinction, but you look at ConvertKit customers, Teachable customers, a lot of them, they're ultimately small/individual business owners, some of whom use these social channels for distribution. The way it's evolving is that's never going to go away. I think the one person business owner is going to keep existing. Platforms give a lot of leverage. You can build an audience. The specific tactics, I think, will keep evolving. Like, I believe courses, as an example, have become a lot less effective. And part of the reason why is the youngest creators, right? Like, we're all kind of old now, candidly.
Yeah.
But you think about the 19-year-olds, the 20-year-olds with 50 million TikTok followers, they don't want to sell courses. They find it kind of weird to do that. They're still selling merch. They're still monetizing in other ways. Most of them are also not really doing an email list. They're just, so that the tactics are changing, but the actual size of economy and who's a creator and them making money, I think is evergreen, will only grow. It just will morph into this thing that may end up looking and feeling quite different from how things used to work. But yeah, I definitely think if you look at least on platforms where I have the data, all the successful creators and stuff are typically slightly older at this point relative to 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that's sort of been a big miss, with the potential exception of Shopify. I think Shopify is actually still in this segment doing quite well with younger generations.
Yeah, that's a fascinating aspect of it. I think ConvertKit is struggling with this. I think a lot of our generation of companies is struggling
Email,
with
right?
this.
Like I know so many people who just like aren't good at checking email anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't like email. I know that. And so there's like this shift to kind of Gen Z creators that I think is a massive shift in terms of what tools they're using, how they're using the internet. But I'm also fascinated by our generation of people. We in each of our own way are creators. You do a lot of content. You share a lot of stuff on Twitter that helps your company. I run this podcast. Like the transition, I think for us in some ways has been harder because as everything has shifted, it's like we were in the old model and there is a new model and it's not totally clear what the new model is because it's not native. I'm not native to it. It's like I didn't grow up on TikTok and Snapchat and all of those things. I grew up on Facebook got invented when I went to college, and that is just fascinating. I lived, I don't know how many years, 8 years of my life, never touching the internet, 10 years of my life, never touching the internet. It's just a different thing from what's going on right now. So it's a fascinating time.
Absolutely. I mean, again, a bit of a diversion, so we won't spend too much time here, but I also think all of that kind of is good for our lives and brains in other ways. Like I look at a lot of people who, I know people who got Instagram at age 10 and 11, and that in turn, I think, we've seen can cause a lot of other issues.
Yeah.
So yes, it may mean we're worse at TikTok and short form video, but I think there's benefits.
Yeah. I want to have Jonathan Haidt on the show at some point to talk about some of this stuff because I think he's doing some of the best work on...
That was the anxious generation?
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating work there on the downsides of all this. Okay. So I want to take a pause here and this will be our little mid conversation break right at an hour in. And when we come back, I want to talk about how you got approached to sell your company, even though you weren't necessarily trying to, what that process was like for you. And then the journey that came on the back end of that, where I think you said that you had, it was reported that the company was sold for in the neighborhood of $250 million. And you have said that you had a $40 million wire deposited in your bank account. And that happened right about the time the pandemic hit. And so there's a fascinating part of your story here I want to dive into in the second half. And then obviously we'll talk about what you're doing now at Carry. So that's what people can look forward to. Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation. And while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator and growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. Okay, so you had this great run at Teachable. You had been growing multiples year over year, the kind of growth any investor wants to see, any founder wants to see, and any leadership team wants to see. as I understand it, you weren't necessarily looking to sell the company, but I also know you were hitting this point where you weren't necessarily enjoying the job as much as you once did. So talk to me about kind of where your head was at and where the company was at when you first got approached by someone that wanted to potentially buy the company.
Absolutely. So from the outside, as things always are, things are going great. I mean, we're growing year over year. Business is looking good. Internally, I was a little concerned because, and I raised this with our team, I felt like our product quality was slipping. Like, I think there were a couple of years where we were materially better than the competition. At the time, we probably still were, but extrapolating that trend forward, we were not going to be. And part of it was our code base was a mess. Like, it was taking too long to do anything. And we just accumulated all this technical debt. And we were internally talking about, should we like rip it apart, start from scratch? It could be 1.5, 2 year rebuild. So all of these discussions were happening in the background. Then coincidentally, we get approached about whether we'd entertain the idea of a sale. And given the fact that there was fatigue, this was, 6+ years in, we were concerned about like kind of long-term, the strength of our product. The timing started to make sense. The thing that sealed the deal or whatever made it 100% worth it is after I sat down with the acquirer, sat down with the team over there, they were just good people. Like founders still led and ran the company. And I knew if I wanted to do a deal, like this is who it would make sense to do a deal with.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. So there are so many layers to selling a company. There's the practical, and can the valuation work for everyone? Can you get to a set of deal terms, which, what gets reported is always like this lump sum number. And then there's all of the detail about what that actually looks like for all the different classes of people involved. There's the emotional layer, there's the team layer, the relational part of that. There's so many layers to this. So from the time you got approached to the time it closed, which was right at the beginning of the pandemic, basically, what was kind of your emotional and logical journey of kind of following along and making the actual decision on whether to sell?
Making the actual decision to sell and getting to a point that we signed a term sheet was relatively quick. That was, I don't know, all in like 6 to 8 weeks, which in grander scheme of things was pretty quick.
Yeah.
Very early on, I was like, does the math work? Okay, cool. Let me think about it. Fine. Like, let me quickly validate there's no one else out there who'd pay substantially more. I didn't spend more than, a couple of phone calls, but enough to ensure that this is a pretty good price. Cool. We signed the term sheet. From that point on, I think is where the work sort of really began. And it was both exhilarating. Like, it was really fun in this way that so much is happening. It's chaotic. It's the sort of stuff that, like, at some level, you're busy, but you like. But also, emotionally, it was quite challenging as well, because there are two such different outcomes of whether the deal goes through or not. Like, outcome one, you have infinite money, life is good, you're chilling. Outcome two, you're right back where you started, except you've wasted a lot of time on this. And you as the seller have to be somewhat okay with both outcomes, right? You have to try to be outcome independent, even though you're not really. All while hiding this from the majority of your team. Like, I'm like disappearing to Brazil for like a week, and I went over Thanksgiving, so no one would find out. But you're playing these games, trying to like come to a conclusion while hiding it from your team. But yeah, a really fun experience as well.
By contractual necessity, by the way, in most of these cases, it's like you literally have to hide it from basically everyone, or it can kill the deal in a lot of cases.
It wasn't contractual necessity for us as much as I know how distracting it is for me. I can't imagine distracting the rest of the team, right? In my mind, I always was like, look, let me pretend like the deal will fall apart. And I'm like, if it falls apart, I'm going to be pretty devastated. I don't want to have to like spend my time consoling everyone else as well.
Yeah.
So our CFO was fully in on it. The leadership team had to eventually come in on it, but I'd left that till as late as I could, and I didn't tell anyone else till after.
So the moment when it was done, the deal terms were done, I think you said that the acquiring team actually flew to New York and you guys hammered it out over a few days and just like got everything all the way.
It was their third or fourth time in New York, but finally it had reached a point where they're like, we're coming to New York. We're not leaving this office. And it was painful. We'd come in the morning, leave at like 10 p.m. at night. But overall, we're doing this until we finish this up.
So you wrap up this contract agreement, and it's not closed, but you have final terms. And now you're at this point where between the two potential outcomes, you kind of know like, all right, I think we're locked in here. Does it start to set in at that point what this is going to mean for your life? Like, does it start to become more personally life-changing at that point? Or I guess, when was the point when you realized, oh my God, like I did the thing that everyone talks about doing. This is about to change everything for me.
It was phases. Like signed term sheet was the first sort of indication, which was many months before. Signed contract, you're like, okay, fine, this is definitely happening. And then a month later, cash in the bank is sort of the final step. With that said, the inflection point I personally felt was when I walked away from like being CEO. Like even getting the money in the bank, doing the exact same job I was doing, honestly didn't really feel that different. But when I was able to like fully like walk away, that's when everything felt very different.
Yeah. And that was a big decision for you. So there's kind of two aspects here. One is that the day you got $40 million wired to you, number one, any sum of money, I'll say north of $1 million, but any sum of money in any great number that you've never seen before in your personal accounts, there's something different. Like we ran a $30 million a year budget by the time I ran ConvertKit. And on some level, it's just numbers in a spreadsheet at some point. It's like numbers go up, other numbers go up, we make it all work. It comes out to the right amount at the bottom and like, fine. You can't get too caught up in it because you'll freak yourself out. There's something different when the money hits your personal bank account. And the really wild part for you is you were still CEO. The pandemic had just started. The stock market was crashing. And so the world is like falling apart as you're having this, what could be considered one of the most momentous periods of your life. And you're sitting alone in your 400 square foot apartment. And I just wonder what that like mix of emotional soup was like at the time. I mean, just like what,
It's like
to be honest, what a cluster of stuff.
Yeah, the world's smallest violin playing for me. Like how
Yeah,
sad.
yeah.
Can't celebrate this. Well, honestly, there's even more going on at the time, which is at that time, our business was growing like 20 or 30% week on week. Like, don't forget, Teachable was still there and having its best week of all time as well. So candidly, I spent most of those first few weeks working harder than I have because like we acquired so much revenue, so many new customers, so much GMV, like business was hectic. So I spent most of the time doing exactly what I was doing, which is working. I eventually bought a car so I could drive out to Rockaway Beach and like go surfing. So that was the other thing I did. That was the first sort of purchase I made. But yeah, otherwise it was like back to work really. And it didn't quite sink in until, many months kind of fully passed.
Yeah. Just a quick little side note. So I've heard you talk about the car as the first thing you bought. You, from a practical mindset, bought a used car that you said it was like $15,000 cheaper than the car you could have bought new. I've wondered every time, what kind of car was it?
It's a BMW X3. It's like, I was like, it needs to be big enough to fit a surfboard. It's a nice car.
Yeah.
It was only a year old. I stand by buying a used car, even in that environment. I mean, we're in New York, right? If I lived in LA, I would buy a flashy new car. It makes sense. New York is not a driving culture. It doesn't make sense here.
Yeah. And no one cares. You're on the subway all the time, walking,
Exactly.
like whatever. Yeah. Okay. That was my own personal curiosity because I had the sense that it was probably a decent car. It clearly wasn't like a Lambo, but it's also funny that you got it and practical that you got it used. Just some things you can't get rid of in the personality.
Can't change who you are.
Okay. That was a little digression. But so in a lot of these types of deals, the CEO, the founder group, the key leaders have incentive packages that both deliver on an amount of value right up front and then also play out over time, where if you stay for a certain amount of time, you hit certain milestones, there's things on the line that you can still continue to earn that make it valuable for you. So the interesting thing for you is you had enough money put in your bank account that the incentive plan has to be massive for it to even be motivating at all, because $40 million is enough money where it's like, does money matter anymore? There's more. You can always go higher, but it has fundamentally shifted things in a way. Like you talked about this with Sam Parr in an episode of his, one of his podcasts, where he was trying to figure out like, what's the number where everything changes? And you were like, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I definitely passed it. So at one point you decided, I don't want to do this anymore. And I'm going to walk away from a $10 million incentive package here. And I wonder if there was a specific experience or moment when you realize I'm done. I just can't do it.
I think that's what's powerful about having money is you're willing to walk away from it. And I definitely feel like I hit the point where I have, whether you call it enough or infinite, that I don't think a bigger package or whatever would have motivated me to stay. I don't think it was one specific moment, but it was just as, we sold the company, work didn't feel any different. The parts that were hard felt even harder, especially because now we had to adapt from being an in-person to a remote company.
Yeah.
So as time passed, I also had very candid conversations with the company that acquired us. I went to Brazil a few times after that, and I was very upfront with them. And being founders themselves, they were honestly quite supportive. I mean, I still remember one of them said, like, you're living the dream. If I was in your position, I would also, like, realize this is not sort of what I want to do. And it was a combination of I wasn't enjoying the job of being a CEO. I also felt like I wasn't very good at it. I felt like our CFO would do a better job at it than I would. So as a result, it became a bit of a no-brainer. We initially tried a hybrid approach where I was superficially the CEO. So I would do the public appearances. I would do like all the outside stuff. And she would like actually run the company and then eventually even walk that back.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that detail before. What was that experience like to be kind of this like figurehead, but not involved in the day-to-day? How was that experience for you?
It was fine. Again, like what that meant on a practical level is I'm still doing PR as needed. I'm still doing our summits. I'm hosting like anything creator facing I'm doing. I was fine with that. I actually enjoyed that part. After a while, the team just found it kind of weird. And that's why the team's like, why, we don't really see him running stuff day to day. Why is he doing this externally? And that's why we walked that back. Even then, like when it came to like giving back the equity I was granted and stuff, like I'm the one who started that conversation just to ensure that like we leave this. Like I could have made some argument like, hey, I'm still helping out, but I'm like, you know what? Let me just like cancel this whole equity grant, take whatever is unvested back, and I'm still a big stakeholder. I continued to stay on the board for quite a bit after. It was only when I started Carry that I fully stepped back from that as well.
What did you think you were going to spend time on when you stepped back? And what did you end up spending time on?
At the time when I stepped back, I was actively running a venture fund. I'd started a venture fund while we were in lockdown and COVID. And initially I found that quite interesting. You keep your brain sharp. For the first time in 6-7 years, I'm looking at brand new companies, things that I've not looked at in a long time. Eventually stepped back with the idea that I'd travel while also running the venture fund. But after about 18 months of sort of being an investor, it started to feel like this is a great hobby, but being a full-time investor is not a full-time job, at least not for me.
So you said you put about a third of that initial fund in with your own money. But when you first got the big payout, it sounds like you were more inclined to be pretty conservative with it, actually, to kind of be like, put it in index funds, essentially. Oh, I'm remembering a thing I meant to mention with the investor updates with your dad. Posting responses to your investor updates from your dad is one of the funniest things I've ever seen in the history of father-son relations, I think. So just for a second, for a callback, give an example of the kinds of responses your dad gives you to your investor updates.
There's one time I remember when, I talked about, I think it was like April 2019. I replied and my dad, classic Indian dad, responded with, yep, as you say, not bad, but could be better, I suppose. And it was, what's also funny and what drives him crazy is that's not his vibe at all. He's like, honestly, the sweetest, most supporting person. It was just that one quote out of context makes everyone think he's a hard ass and never impressed and all of that. So he doesn't love it for that reason. But every time I post that, it goes viral all over again with other immigrant kids recreating their trauma.
But it's very clear that relationship has been very special to you, and that he's been there for you, and vice versa over the years. And it was actually a conversation with him, as I understand it, that changed kind of your outlook in terms of how to use some of the money from an investment perspective. So I'm curious how that conversation shaped what you ended up doing with the money from an investment side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was the one who effectively pushed me to take more risk. I mean, his entire argument was the dollars I have, the money I have, like no one in our entire family has ever come close to this, may never come close to this. You can take a piece of it, carve that out. Even that piece alone is infinite money. So why not take the rest and actually think bigger, go for broke, whatever. So he pushed me to take, a lot more risk. And as a result, I ended up allocating almost half of the dollars I had to like just investing myself, whether it's picking stocks, which I thought I was a genius at, maybe not anymore, mostly in venture funds, my own funds, a little bit in friends' companies, all of that.
I'm curious what you've learned being in the seat of investor, even though I know that's not like the focus anymore. What you learned being in that seat that you didn't know when you were only in the founder seat.
Venture fund math, you realize how lopsided it is. Like every time people accuse venture investors of being like, oh, they're like chasing these like improbable numbers, you realize most companies suck. Most companies are going to be zero. Most companies are going to fail. So to make your entire math work out, you actually do need that outsized success. I mean, I've talked to the people. I think we know a lot of people who are running venture funds that are kind of the opposite, where they're like, we don't want the big exit. We want the sort of safe and stable companies or whatever. I personally don't believe that model works. I don't believe the math works. Like I think just any kind of business fails enough that you need a large enough success to sort of make it work out when you have a portfolio of bets. The other option is you can do private equity, but for venture specifically, that's how it works.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of my worst investments were me not grasping that and like investing in like pretty good companies at a great price. Doesn't matter. Venture doesn't matter if your company's pretty good. There's only a few companies that matter, and all that matters if you're a piece of that, if you got a piece of that. So those were some of the lessons. Still learning. I mean, investing also is fairly humbling.
So I kind of broke down what I've heard you talk about in terms of how you spent your money, and I put them in buckets of family, experiences / travel, and then investment. So we talked about the investment piece. On the family side, you bought your car and that was like a modest little purchase, but then you also bought a home in Brooklyn. One of the things I've heard you talk about is it was important to you to buy a home that had enough space where your parents could come and visit for long periods of time and have that be enjoyable, to have enough kind of square footage that would work. What did money enable with your family, I guess? And how did you use that as a priority in shaping what you did with that money after you got it?
The biggest thing is it allowed you to do is freedom, really. It allowed me to go and spend the time with them when I wanted to, allowed me to walk away from, the job or whatever I didn't want to do. And even now it's, being able to go on a family vacation where I'm paying for it's a really nice feeling. It's still, again, parents still struggle with it. Like one of the reasons I had to get good at learning how to use credit card points is my parents don't let me buy them a flight. But if it's on credit card points, they're okay with it. So if I want to actually get them a flight, it has to be through points. So now I only spend my points on getting them flights because they don't want me to spend cash to buy them flights. But something I also was noticing that's really nice is now when we travel, we stay at nicer places than we ever have and stuff. And I was talking to a friend of mine who comes from a pretty wealthy family. And even though he's done very well, he can never have that same experience with them because the best he can do is foot the bill for the same experiences his family has already had. So it's actually really nice that my parents now in their 60s get to experience a lot of these really nice things for the first time. They look at it with brand new eyes, and that is super nice. And yeah, in general, the only sort of, everyone says this, but to experience it, the only thing that lasts in terms of direct happiness for money is spending it on people you care about. And this is, very direct example.
Yeah, I love that. It seems obvious once you say it, which is sometimes what some of the best stuff is. But yeah, when you come from wealth, there's a standard that everyone's used to. And when you come from even just middle class
we were totally fine.
Right?
I'm not, yeah, exactly. But we're not staying at super nice hotels or whatever until maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah. I had a great upbringing, but we also stayed in Hampton Inns and Best Westerns growing up, and that was our standard fare. And so being able to do a nice vacation here and there, stay in a nicer place is just a wonderful. Yeah, I love
room service. Felt like it was cost unlimited money. We would never do that. Mini bar, just all these silly little things that net aren't even that expensive, but it's just not something we ever touched.
Yeah, I love that. So you went on kind of a walkabout for a while, something like 18 months of travel. And I'm curious if there's a moment on those travels where you kind of sat down, maybe at a dinner alone, or just a moment on a beach or great hotel or something where everything kind of settled in and it hit you that this was your life, that you just had this new privilege and freedom that you didn't have before. There was kind of a moment that was emblematic of that.
It was not a specific single moment, but it was again, running a company in person for that long, I did feel like I never had like that experience in my early 20s where a lot of people take a gap year or whatever. So it felt like travel was a thing I wanted to do. In my mind, I thought, I'd get the travel bug out of my system. I'd do it. I'd be kind of over it. And again, I traveled growing up with my parents, but never really since. So went all over. Even with travel, I can't change who I am. I became like fairly like goal oriented no matter where I was. Like in Brazil, I was at a surf camp and I wanted to become very good at surfing. And it was always it was never like pure leisure. Pure leisure wasn't that fun, but I honestly had a phenomenal time. Something I don't relate to is a lot of people say, they sold their business, they weren't working there anymore, they had a loss of identity, it was like depressing. I didn't have that. I felt like pretty good to like not be dealing with the day to day of running a business. And I again went back to like self reflecting, like what are the things that, make me happy. And I gravitated towards going to places where I could spend a lot of time outdoors. Like, I got in better shape than I was before. I started working out more. A lot of places I had my friends come with me and kind of alternated between traveling with my parents, traveling with friends, traveling alone. It felt phenomenal. Like towards the back end of that is when I just started feeling nostalgic for like doing work that I cared about with people I cared about. And that's what eventually kind of brought me back.
One of the things you've said is that you did all of these optimizations to like make sleep work for you while you were leading the company, and you could do almost anything under the sun to try and get better sleep. And there was some fundamental difference between how well you rested when you were leading the company versus some point at which you crossed this threshold and things changed for you. I'm wondering, how long did it take you outside of the company to realize that there was just some background stress that was part of that role that didn't allow you to fully turn off, to fully rest in the way that you needed to?
So that's the best part of this Aura Ring. I don't use it that much, but I've kind of had it for the last 5 years. So you can categorically see as soon as I take away my day-to-day job, I change my environment, everything changes. Selling the company, no difference at all. And I see like stuff on Twitter and stuff all the time where someone's like, guys, do you have any recommendation for like what sleep stack to use? I use like all these supplements and this and this and this. And it's like a 24-year-old kid that should be sleeping great, but has a horribly stressful job, right? So again, I went through the same thing. I was like, let me get like blackout shades and like give up alcohol for a while and all of that. And nothing made a difference, like taking away the root cause of what was stressing you out. In my case, my job. So I think for a lot of people, you don't need sleep medication. You need to like change the thing that's putting your mind not at ease.
So you had this nostalgia for building a company, for teams. And where were you in the world when you realized like, I got the bug again, I got to go do something?
I started having it, I want to say like early summer. And I was coming back to New York just because I loved summer in New York. So that was the time I was anyways coming back. But I remember telling myself at the end of the summer, I was going to go surfing in Portugal. And that was going to be my like time to fully think about if I wanted to do it, especially because it's an irreversible decision. Once you do this, you're kind of in it for 10 more years.
However long, yeah.
Correct. As we're getting closer and closer to the time that I had to go leave for Portugal, I just realized I didn't even want to go. I didn't want to go surf. I didn't want to go to Europe. I just wanted to like sit and like start working on this. And that became the moment when I knew.
Oh, that's fascinating. What are you doing differently this time as you build this company versus what you did with Teachable?
Doing a few things differently, but like the caveat I always make is I told the team too, like, let's all expect we're going to make a second set of mistakes. I think to get good at something, you have to do it many, many times. 2 is still a very, very small sample size.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe this time we're being a lot more product focused. Like at Teachable, I think eventually we got very good at selling what we had. But once we got to a few $1 million in revenue, our retention economics or like expansion revenue, all of that wasn't good enough. And like the base on which we built this was not strong enough. So here we decided to like spend no money on paid marketing for the first couple of years, really invest in sort of a deeper and better product experience with the idea that like I'm fine growing a little bit slower early on in order to grow much more effortlessly in years 4, 5, and 6. Because for us, that definitely got pretty hard.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of focusing more on the product and making sure everything,
small
the
small
fundamentals.
team is super important, like even more so than last time. In a practical way, what that means is we'll just hire a lot more contractors and stuff. Like we'll keep our core team small. We'll allocate more dollars to like third party outside resources, especially in things like marketing and stuff, versus building a large in-house team. And this is not different, but the other thing that was very important to us is to do this in person. Like the time we did this company, that was atypical, but I just didn't want to spend all day on Zoom, sitting behind a computer. So
I get
super
that. That
important.
was a massive motivation for me after working remotely for a long time. So, to what extent is the way you're building this company designed for your own experience at this point?
Parts of it you could argue are like, for instance, we're in person and, like the office is like 15 minutes from my house. But I think it's more a case of finding people that are similarly motivated that want the same kind of outcome. I'm still, in general, like in some ways, this feels higher stakes than Teachable did because at the time, no one kind of expects you to succeed the first time around.
Mm,
This time, I feel like it would be embarrassing not to. Like I've sat on panels telling people how to run a company. It would look pretty bad if the guy telling other people what to do ends up having a catastrophic failure. I also just take a lot of responsibility in that all of our early team, they're super motivated, right? But they've basically taken a leap of faith that if they give me their time, effort, energy, I will create a good outcome for them. And that's not something I take lightly. So in a lot of ways, a lot of this feels harder, but it's also just a different time.
how do you square that kind of weight of that feeling that you wouldn't want to fail this time around because you've been through it, you know so much, people expect higher things, with just the reality of the odds that having been an investor and having been in this game for a long time?
It's tough, but I do believe that perceived lack of optionality will increase the odds of success.
Mm.
Like I believe if I'm like, it doesn't matter if we succeed or fail, because there are parts of this journey that suck, that will always suck. And you have to sort of have the attitude of like, I'm not going to take an L no matter what. And of course, if it happens, it happens. But I think that dedication makes a difference. Like personally, it's something that surprised me as an investor, how many companies and founders raised money in a really easy market. And as soon as things got hard, they pieced out. And I didn't love that. Like, it's
I
not
didn't
how
even know
I
that was an
operated.
option.
Yeah, a lot of them give money back. They're like, here's like 30 cents of the dollar. We ran the company for 1 year, didn't find product market fit. Thank you for backing us. And like 2 months later, they're trying to start another company, which I didn't love.
Well, we won't go down that rabbit hole because that is a whole can of worms. But so you mentioned factors that relate to this, but I get the sense that whether it's just inherent in the way that you lead or it's something conscious for you, that culture really matters. What people show up to every day. It's not just what they're working on, what the product is. That's that the experience of work matters to you. How do you think about building culture, I guess, within your team?
One of the other learnings I had from Teachable is I think early on we over-indexed on pedigree. Pedigree could be like in the most extreme example where they went to school or where they worked at or whatever, instead of finding people that really want to work at a startup. And the reason for that mistake, it kind of makes sense because back when I started my career, working in a startup was weird. So anyone that wanted to do that was special. Like there's something weird or broken or twisted that they wanted that. Then there was a period of time where startups became trendy and a lot of people, it was just a place to work. This time I've gone back to like the people that want to work at Carry today are a little bit weird because most people don't want to work in an office 5 days a week. We tell people up front that like, it's not, I don't think we have a crazy work culture, but it's, we're not optimizing purely for like simplicity or comfort. We're dealing with, pretty hard problems. But as a result, finding people that want to be there is, I think, just makes for a substantially better environment. And when you combine that with also trying to not take yourself too seriously, I think that's a really fun combination where, we take our work seriously, but in our office there's always banter and jokes and whatever. So it's a pretty light atmosphere.
Yeah. That fun aspect of work, I think, is easy to underestimate, and just the playfulness and the jokes, and my team used to just laugh at me when I'd get off on a tangent or like do a pep talk or just kind of be silly sometimes because, people are humans. They want to have fun. They don't want to feel like
Absolutely.
everything's so serious all the time.
Absolutely. I like the downside is I don't think my team is like afraid of me, which is a fine trade-off I'll take. They're the first to give me shit for anything. So
Yeah, well, everything has a downside, I guess.
absolutely. I'll
Um,
take it.
so you had these four things that you tweeted, you've talked about in different interviews that you say you've realized are your motivators now, and they're time outside, it's moving your body, getting exercise, it's quality time with people you love, building relationships, and then it's work with purpose. It's so fascinating to me because number one, it mirrors a lot of my own. I think these are kind of fundamental motivators for many people. I wonder how long it took you to realize that this was your list of things. This was the things you wanted to optimize for, what that process was like.
This definitely happened in the time when I was traveling. And it was more that if at any point I realized I wasn't feeling good, this is almost like my path. If like you want to feel good and you don't feel good, you can reverse engineer, do those four things, and you'll be shocked if you don't feel good. The parts that I actually found the most surprising were like, yes, relationship and work with purpose, you kind of get, like, you know that. But the simple act of like spending time outside and moving my body are the ones that probably surprised me more because those are the ones that you tend to underestimate. And honestly, when you think about the average remote worker in the US or frankly anywhere, their lives are almost the opposite of this. You're spending your time isolated, you're spending your time indoors, you're not moving your body, probably in a job you hate, right? So it's like literally the opposite of all four of those. But yeah, for me, it's like I can reverse engineer that and feel pretty good.
I love that. I think it's one of these things that whether it's these four things that people adopt or whether it's their own list, I think there's near infinite return on the time invested learning what yours are. It just seems like the kind of thing that we should be teaching, maybe more often,
Yeah,
like
it's
helping
just
people get in touch
hard
with
when you're
themselves.
caught in the day to day, like getting away from sort of base reality and being able to travel and kind of reset. With travel, you got a chance to reset every few weeks. You just get more repetitions. It was just easier to see patterns than if you're living your life, doing your job day to day. It's just so much harder.
Yeah. Yeah, that resonates with me. I think that's probably true. We're coming up on our time here, and I made a conscious choice in this conversation not to do the thing that you've done a bunch, which is that
Yep.
you are a world-class expert on, or you're growing towards it, on tax strategy for business owners, on self-employed people, on just general tax strategy, which is really related to what you do at Carry. I mean, you've built basically the investment platform that you wished existed, low or no fee, super easy to access, great tax strategy backing it, and all of these kind of things built in that you wish you had known about when you were making all your money and now taking care of it. The two things I wanted to say about this are, one, you did kind of what I considered to be the best possible interview on all these tactics with Chris over at All the Hacks. And I just thought, why would I repeat that? I should just send people to All the Hacks to listen to you and Chris talk about, between the two of you. It was like, wow, man, I just need to go
I
spend a
learned a
half
lot
day
from
with these two.
I learned a lot from him as well. It was not like I was the expert. It was him riffing as much, if not more, than I was.
He was deep in it. So if you want a masterclass in perfectly legal designed tax strategies in the tax code for being a business owner or just a high earner of any kind, that episode is fantastic. But you also do a ton of webinars and educational content. I mean, the backlog of content on Carrie's blog is incredible. It's coming up on tax season. This will come out before the end of the year. I just want people to know that those things exist. And I made the conscious choice not to go down that because you've done it so well elsewhere.
I appreciate that. I'm sick and tired of repeating that stuff. So
So I'll ask you my two typical closing questions as our wrap up here, having kind of like promoted the things that I think that you're really great at and people should know about. The first closing question is, what's the most beautiful version of the future that you're hoping to contribute to through your work?
when I think back on, like, you'll see over the course of the last 2 hours, there have been numerous times when I've said, like, was in the right place at the right time, like things sort of happened. I think if we could move towards a world where, like, I strongly believe talent is evenly distributed, opportunity is not. So anything we can do, and in my case, like, immigration is like that specific interpretation of that to like equalize the opportunity. To me, that's a great way of like doing net good in the world while potentially also serving whatever cause you want to, whether it's like making America better or capitalism or whatever. So I think that is a version of the world that, I feel strongly about, and signing recommendation letters is step one of what I hope to be many, many steps in the future to make that possible for a lot of it. I always tell people I did pretty well here. Back home, I was not the smartest kid in school. There's smarter people back there. So let's help them come here.
I love that. Deeply personal, clearly. I'm curious what the next step is. What do you think the next step is going to be in that process for you?
The way I think about it, it's life has several chapters. Carrie is an important chapter in my life that makes it hard to do multiple things. But I deeply suspect whatever is after Carrie won't look the same. I don't know what field or whatever it will be in, but I don't think, like, there are some people that are serial startup people. It may seem that way. I've, done 2 startups in a row, but I would suspect whatever I do next might look dramatically different. The specific form factor, I don't know. Like, I don't think I'm going to get into politics or whatever, but I think it'll be a very different sort of life.
That's awesome. Well, my last question is, who are you becoming through the work that you do every day?
Still figuring it out. I still don't have the answer to who I'm becoming. What I've noticed, if I sort of think about like what are the trends in the work I'm doing and so forth, pretty much everything in my career to this point has been, I don't know if I want to call it creative, serving the business owner, serving the person that's building the other thing. And I think that's a fantastic theme to sort of bet your life or career on. One of our first investors at Teachable had this observation where he's like, Teachable as an idea makes sense because there's no one in the world more motivated than an entrepreneur, than a business owner. And if you make the teacher the entrepreneur or the business owner, like, you capitalize on that motivation. So that's sort of been the trend that's bringing a lot of my work together. How it's going to evolve and change me as a person has to be seen.
Yeah. It's a great place to end. It's the old pickaxes and shovels theory and taking something in motion and accelerating it. Ankur, thanks for being here, man. I have so much admiration for you and just grateful to call you a friend and to get to be a peer along the journey. So appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and thanks for steering off the beaten path with this one.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Good Work. My name is Barrett Brooks. I'm your host, and my guest today was Ankur Nagpal. Ankur is the founder of Carry, an investment platform for business owners and freelancers, people who earn their own living and want the best possible investment and tax strategy available to them. You can find Carry at carry.com. If you're interested in checking out Teachable, which was the first company that Ankur built and sold for a reported $250 million, they're at teachable.com. They are a great platform for building and hosting your courses online. And if you'd like to check out his venture capital fund, you can do that at vibe.vc. You can also find Ankur on Twitter or X at Ankur Nagpal. That's ANKURNAGPAL. He's probably most active there of all the social platforms. Ankur is a wonderful human being, someone that I hope that you'll follow along with. And of course, all of the resources, all of the links, everything we talked about in this episode, you can find at goodworkshow.com. Really grateful you're here with me today. I don't take it for granted that you spend an hour and a half, 2 hours with me every week, hopefully. If this is your first time listening to the show, I'd love it if you hit subscribe wherever you got this episode, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever else. If you hit subscribe, you get every episode right in your feed. And of course, if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you grabbed the link to this episode wherever you listened and dropped it in a text message to just one friend you think would enjoy it, someone who might be inspired by Ankur's story and might take some lessons away that they can apply to their own life and career. Podcasts grow through word of mouth. That's the fact of the matter. And so I rely on you to share it with people you think will enjoy it. I'd be grateful for it. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks. Once again, this show is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. I couldn't do it without them. Grateful you were here today. I'll catch you on the next episode.